Good afternoon, and thank you to Lauren Noble and the Buckley program for inviting me to this incredible event today. It's actually my second Ideas Forum experience. A year ago, I was here as an audience member, and this year I'm proud and thankful to have the opportunity to present my idea to all of you. There's nothing that makes me feel more hopeful and certain about our nation's future than so many compelling ideas about how to improve it. America faces a civic education crisis. There's no more appropriate way to put it. The statistics tell us that we are simply not providing our students, at least in their K-12 education, with the tools they need to be active and effective citizens in our country. As a nation, we have failed to prioritize the importance of history and civics education, and in our standards and curriculum, instead opting for more short-term and skill-based knowledge. The age of a liberal education appears to be over, having been replaced by education fads of today, such as one-to-one student-to-screen ratios and the so-called personalized learning movement. We can see the effects of this in survey after survey. As the American Council of Trustees and Alumni noted in their 2016 Civic Education report, students do not know the father of the Constitution, and nearly 10% say that Judith Sheindlin, or Judge Judy, is on the Supreme Court of the United States. And this isn't the worst of it. In 2010, the federal government administered the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Some of you may know it as the NAEPS test. And the results were even more alarming. The test revealed that less than a quarter of American high school seniors would qualify as proficient or above in civics education, and that almost 40% were found to have less than basic knowledge of American civics, meaning that they were totally unable to list forms of political participation such as voting, free speech, and congressional lobbying. And the same issue doesn't end in college, even at our best institutions. The ACTA found in a 2015 survey of current undergraduates that 60% of students cited Thomas Jefferson as the father of the American Constitution, despite the fact that he was not even present for its creation or signing. Over half couldn't name one step in the process of ratifying a constitutional amendment, and almost half were unaware of Congress's power to declare war. In contrast, according to the ACTA, over 3/4 of college graduates over the age of 65 could explain the constitutional amendment process proficiently. Up here now is one of the questions presented on the NAEP test, which the overwhelming majority of students answered incorrectly. We're not going to have a pop quiz today, but everyone should think about whether they know the answer to this question, and if not, about why that may be. Perhaps ask if you were ever taught information like this in school, college, or in your daily life. It would be interesting to see an age breakdown in the room about who gets this answer correct. We can see here that somewhere along the way we have chosen as a country to take a different path in how we teach young people about the country they live in. And it has had truly disastrous consequences. With so much talk about the toxic, bitter, and populist nature of political culture today, I am yet surprised that our politicians seem so disinterested in aggressively combating this problem in order to protect the sanctity of our republic and its democratic processes. Of course, there are exceptions. In response to the new AP U.S. History framework released by the College Board in 2014, some of you in the room may remember that controversy, a group of American professors, including academics from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford, released a public letter stating that, quote, "The new framework is organized around such abstractions as identity, peopling, work exchange and technology, and human geography, while downplaying essential subjects such as the sources, meaning, and development of America's ideals and political institutions, notably the Constitution. And if we are willing to accept that the end of traditional civic education has been done intentionally, which I believe it has, we can begin to understand who benefits and why. It is those who view the government as the ultimate source of good and who see its actions as the primary cure to all social pathologies that benefit from this lack of civic knowledge. A student who has not been versed in American founding ideals and constitutional concepts such as federalism, checks and balances, and preferring perhaps a democratic mode of deliberation to an aristocratic one, we won't be able to recognize government abuse of power for what it is. This hypothetical student will think little of Uncle Sam telling businesses who exactly they can and can't serve. He will think little of our government being complicit in the mass harvesting and sale of personal data being carried out by our monopolistic tech companies. And he will think little of a United States congressman demanding that upwards of 70% of his income ought to be the property of the government. The slow degradation of American history, I think, teaching is the culmination of a deliberate effort by some of America's elites representing a certain viewpoint to remove the foundation of Western political thought from the minds of young people and replace it with the more in-fashion ideologies such as equality of all cultures across all time, regardless of said culture's values or actions, a view of laws and justice through a strictly Marxist lens, and a guiding principle of moral relativism. It has unfortunately been quite successful, and as we can see up here, has rendered our methods of public discourse and protest severely broken. It is my belief that only swift, far-reaching cooperation between all 50 states' educational leaders can solve this problem. That is why I propose amending the Common Core state standards to include a historical and civic education framework. The current Common Core state standards, which have been formally adopted by 42 of the 50 states in the Union, include no specific guidelines for historical education. Rather, they only set guidelines for education in mathematics and language arts. As most of us in this room likely know, while vitally important in all careers and life in general, arithmetic and writing alone do not constitute a virtuous citizen. And even basic understanding of history and civics is left out of the Common Core. And American political culture, in my opinion, has the potential to continue degrading if this is not changed rapidly. The crafters of the Common Core need to reconvene over the course of several years and set standards of historical and civic education. As with the first edition of the Common Core, states cannot and absolutely should not be legally compelled or financially compelled to adopt these standards, as has been done in the past. But most will if they understand the important role that a knowledge of historical and political analysis has in making moral, deliberative citizens. These new guidelines for historical education will sit alongside the mathematics and language arts benchmarks and will help states better teach history and civics. A national committee made up of teachers, historians, parents, and local leaders from all states will work together to discuss what information is necessary at each grade level and which ideas are important for young people to engage with at which times. These new guidelines would ensure the teaching of important American historical figures and documents from an early age, and the expectations of knowledge would be rigorous, ambitious, and result in most students having enough an understanding to meaningfully engage with the political process on their own instead of being directed to what to believe and do by the endless influence that mass media has in our lives today. While such a change to the standards will surely not solve all of America's problems with political discourse and civic participation, a higher expectation of knowledge about America and world history, as well as so-called founding ideals, will undoubtedly help. Undoubtedly, one of the most well-known Bill Buckley quotes, of course, is this line from the mission statement of the National Review, which Buckley penned for the magazine's first issue in 1955. It read, "If National Review is superfluous, it is so for very different reasons. It stands athwart history, yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who so urge it." For Buckley, the conservative rejects the all-too-common notion that the arc of history necessarily bends toward justice. While many on the right today have argued over this description of conservatism, almost all agree with the unsaid premise of Buckley's claim. That is, we have to have a commonly understood history to yell at, right? And we cannot at all begin to engage politically if we fundamentally misunderstand our political system, its history, and how it actually works. In recent decades, the necessity of history as not only a course of study, but as an essential precursor to an informed population has been largely forgotten by American elites. It is my opinion that Mr. Buckley would have been deeply troubled by the level of control and agenda that has been applied to these elites, by these elites to America's education system at this time today, especially in the arena of history and civics. The decay of historical knowledge among Americans has in large part, in my opinion, led to the rampant social pathologies we observe today. And they are observed by many of our political and social scientists. By leaving history behind in a way, we have absolutely started to forget the common American project. By making this change, we can help bring that project back. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with your diagnosis of this problem. And I've been a teacher myself. I was thinking when you were talking about this, the last class I taught, a government class a few years ago, not at an elite school, I might say, but with 15 kids, good kids, smart kids in their own way. Not one of them knew that the Declaration of Independence took place in 1776. I thought that was a year that was kind of in people's minds, for instance. So I agree that we have a big problem here. On the other hand, your prescription kind of terrifies me, which is to say that let's have the very kinds of bureaucrats who we were talking about as our enemy in the last presentation come up with a new set of standards to go out to the state. And it would seem to me that they would likely have exactly the principles that you mentioned in that were attacked in the letter in terms of teaching history as a matter of identity and so forth. So tell me why I shouldn't be worried about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I knew this question would come up because obviously on the conservative sides of debate in America, the Common Core was very controversial. There were certain notable figures, of course, who did support it, such as Jeb Bush, Lamar Alexander. But at the end of the day, it is, in my view, a cooperation ideally among states. I don't agree with what has been done in the past with the Common Core by the federal government. I don't think that sort of pragmatically the federal Department of Education necessarily needs to be that involved in this. I think it's a cooperation between state school administrators and local school administrators in order to adopt these standards. So to be clear, I don't think there should be any threat of financial penalty. There should be no punitive force to adopt these. I do think that states would end up adopting them because they want to stay competitive with each other, and they know that there's a problem with civic education.
I just want to start by saying amen, and I mean that, of course, in a secular way. But it's funny. I just met with somebody who was part of the Common Core, and I've worked against Common Core in a couple of states. But I just met with somebody kind of serendipitously in Virginia this week, who was part of the original group that put this together, and he said that they specifically avoided history. Yeah. Because they knew they would never get it through if they opened up the controversy. And the obvious question, of course, is whose history? Who decides? Who decides what those are? And I also want to ask if you've looked at what Richard Dreyfuss is doing, which is a side thing. But
so what's happening today largely is, since there's no federal standard for historical education, in my opinion, a lot of the decision-making about what kids are learning is coming from, which I think is even worse than the bureaucrats in the Department of Education, is coming from the textbook companies, because textbooks don't make individual textbooks for each state's standards. They sort of craft their standards, and the states have no choice if they want a textbook to live up to those. So I think, kind of against what a lot of people would say, I think this would be putting more hands in sort of a democratic process, because right now the textbook bureaucrats do have a lot of power in choosing what students learn at all times. And like I said, this would be a group not of career bureaucrats in D.C. This would ideally be the commissioners of education from each state and a selection of principals.
No, I'm terrified.
I'm terrified too.
And I haven't looked at what Richard Dreyfuss is doing.
And I'm not sure how far he's gotten with it, but he's trying to bring basic civics back into every classroom in America. And I don't know whether he's getting any traction, but that's become his thing. I'd never thought Richard Dreyfuss would be in that area, but that's what he's decided is what ails America.
I mean, if I may, I'm confident that we can come up with some sort of group that would be able to reach a consensus about what students should know that is, like the academics I read off of, it is definitely not an agreed-upon consensus that certain changes that have been made should be made. And I think we need to look at what we've done in the past as conservatives.
Certainly Constitution. That's,
yeah,
Constitution,
absolutely.
That's one we could all agree on. Okay.
And like I said, those over 65 who are college graduates tend to have a much better understanding of our political processes. Maybe we should look back and think what we were doing different back then.
I think that I'm just going to be repeating thematically what my two cohorts here have said, but I don't understand how you would in any way reach consensus, even with this group that you're talking about? How do you mitigate these competing agendas in the current environment that we have with identity politics, advocacy versus, the thesis that you're,
Right.
Proposing?
The focus of mine, it's a little misleading when I say history. When I say history, I really mean a focus on civics and founding ideals especially. Mm-hmm. I really don't think that it is going to be that controversial that students should know about the Constitution and ways to participate.
How do you know that?
I think most states that have already adopted their own historical standards do have an agreement that civic education is important, but those current standards don't do enough. It seems, you're right, with the changing sort of political landscape of the time, maybe things that we would have 20 years ago thought were objectively good for students to know, like the Constitution, could now be seen as offensive. But I think that, I reject the notion that everything is necessarily equal in importance in history. I think there are certain objective, important points that we should touch on with our students. And I think that while the landscape is changing, most people can agree that it's important for constitutional knowledge to be available to students and for them to know how to vote and how to participate in a democracy. But I knew that this was going to be the main sort of friction point because it necessarily involves cooperation among the states, hopefully not directly the federal government, in something that it doesn't talk about at all in the Constitution, which is education, and ideally should be left up to the states to choose on their own.
It would seem that the private sector can take the lead in all of this. What I mean by that is Hillsdale College, from what I know of it, is that it requires, before graduation from the university, a course, at least a semester, if not a year, of the United States Constitution. Also, they don't accept any federal funds for any projects, scientific or academic. And in that way, they don't have that force from Washington pressing them to preach preach to them. So I wonder if our elite universities, and here Yale is one of them, would require that there be the requirement before graduation of a course in American politics, say Constitution, and that they look at carefully what they're receiving from the federal government for substance of whatever courses might be involved.
Right, absolutely. I would be totally in support of that happening at colleges, public and private, across the United States. My one well, I have a few concerns. One is that I largely agree with you. At even like places at Yale, you can get away without taking one necessarily American history class throughout your entire 4 years at Yale. You just have to take something that's in the humanities, which could be, South American history or the history of exploration of Australia, or all these different things that don't factor in American history. I think that should change. I also think that the sort of symbiotic but harmful relationship that exists between federal funding and private and public schools across the country is bad, and we should get rid of that. My third point is that we should also make this happen, but I think that civics education shouldn't be something that you're first introduced to in college. I think that there is ways that we can teach it in which we can teach these concepts in a more simple way starting early on in elementary school. They're really not that complex of concepts to introduce. So that's why this presentation had more of a K-12 focus, but I would not at all be opposed. In fact, I would be the first to support that change happening at private and public universities.
So I have a question about in your presentation you mentioned how 65-year-olds have a better understanding of American history. I don't know your exact phrasing, but along those lines, and I believe to a response to Mr. O'Reilly's question, you said that they were doing better, 65-year-olds were doing better at the time. We should learn from what they were doing at the time and better structure our educational system towards how they were doing it then. My question is, what were they doing then as opposed to what we're doing now and those differences?
Well, I think if we go back, and it would be an interesting historical study to do, I'm sure, in academia, and it would take a while, and looked at state standards, say, from perhaps between 1930 and 1970 or something like that. I would hedge a bet that there would be less of these sort of abstract, obscure concepts where time is being focused on, like peopling and human geography and identity, and more time spent on these specific civics points. I guess that would be the answer to my question. Correlation doesn't necessarily obviously prove causation. It's also possible that 65-year-olds are 3 times as knowledgeable than recent college graduates about civics, just by virtue of the fact that they've lived for 45 or 50 more years. But you would think that perhaps those who leave, especially America's elite institutions, should be ready to engage and shouldn't be 3 times less knowledgeable after just coming out of Yale or Harvard about civics education than the average 65-year-old in the United States.
Plus, there was the ruler across the knuckles, which seemed.
At the expense of being repetitive, Kobe, who are these historians that you're going to rely on? You've said that I'm confident about them, but with the Constitution being considered a racist document and grievance and oppression being the primary aspect of American history, and knowing history, and even at Yale, who are these people who are going to change? You mentioned the advanced placement by the College Board, which is basically a de-emphasis of American history.
Absolutely.
At the expense of adding world history when these people don't know anything. So this is already moved down there. And I'm really skeptical of your confidence. I want to know who these people are that would be on this national committee, and not in a general context, not bureaucrats, et cetera, but names of people who would actually be selected by politicians and the government to do this work. What you say is totally critically important, for sure.
Right, absolutely. I would liken this process, ideally, I would change it much from how the original Common Core was not only created but rolled out. I'm from a state that has not adopted the Common Core, and I was involved with our state education system when there was the argument about that. It was a horrible rollout. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. I would actually look, I don't want to say, I would kind of craft the Common Core revising after something like a constitutional amendment convention. I would have certain benchmarks that each state has to meet for who they send, but I think each state should be able to send 2 or 3 representatives to this. I don't think that there should just be representation from elite schools or academia. I am hesitant to give exact names of who would be on these committees because I think it's hard to find, off the top of my head, any academic. I'm sure you could find something that they've said that is questionable. I also think that if we try to we know that academics have different slants and people have different slants. I think if we try to be even about who we put on this working group, this committee, that we will approach something that looks like what students should learn if we are representative of all of the states and regions across the United States. Also looking at the current standards that individual states have in place.
Thank you, Kobe. That was a fantastic presentation. And I completely agree that you're spot on with your analysis of the problem and your diagnosis. However, just out of curiosity, what incentive do legislators and those that are, say, are more or less the crafters of Common Core, what is their incentive to fix this problem? Aside from the obvious of those in the room that are in relative concurrent of the issue, curious about the incentive problem. Thanks.
I think it takes a recognition and an admittance from leaders in all states that this is a huge problem that needs to be fixed. I don't believe that we should have any sort of punitive incentive that is put on by the Federal Department of Education or the federal government. But like I said earlier in my presentation, just as has happened with the Common Core, a lot of people don't realize this, the 8 states who've yet to adopt the Common Core, if you go and look up their standards, and read their standards. For example, Alaska or Florida. I think Virginia hasn't adopted the Common Core. They they look remarkably similar to the Common Core in a lot of these states. This made a lot of people angry eventually, or at one point, but states want to remain competitive with each other, including the ones that don't adopt Common Core. And we see something that looks miraculously like the Common Core in states like Alaska and Virginia. I think that the competition piece and wanting the product of their K-12 system to be as ready for a college education as from other states should be enough of an incentive. Obviously, that hasn't played out yet, since this is a hypothetical idea, but we would have to look at that at the time and evaluate how many states have adopted.
Hi. As someone who sits in the state legislature, I actually think a piece of legislation has been proposed this year to require civics education, but we are constantly getting pushback from putting mandates on schools. Last year, what was it, Holocaust education, Joe? There's the Irish potato famine. I would, civics is extremely important. And I think it is a key, plays a critical role. But if you are saying we should not be telling schools what they have to teach, could you address that argument?
There's a few points here. The first point is that maybe if we went back in an ideal world, we would have a totally different philosophical conversation about the creation of the Common Core in the first place. I don't think anyone disagrees with that about how we could create it and the rollout. William F. Buckley said that conservatism is the politics of reality, right? I think we should look at the system that is in place right now as conservatives and try to figure out how we can make it work best for us. That said, that is a totally valid philosophical point about what we should and shouldn't be teaching, or shouldn't be telling schools and individual districts what they should teach their students. I will say that standards, not curriculum, but standards, as you know, are much less invasive into the school ideally than something like curriculum. Ideally, the standards are the bare minimum of what students at each grade level should know, and then they turn it over to X, Y, or Z district and say, you guys have absolute autonomy about how you teach that and specifics about what characters you want to be known in history and how you want to display this, when you want to display it. So that's what I would say. Ideally, standards are kept absolutely minimal, and I would want to keep with that in this.
When it comes to the educational and the legislative systems, we are running into a wall that we can't overcome. And when you look at a few of the movies or shows that have come out, like 1776 and even Hamilton, those have been effective ways to reach groups that we have not reached before. And we really need an extra educational way of conservatives not losing the media battle. We need more producers and publishers to work our side.
Right. Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, the center of our mass culture and what people are exposed to from a young age is in Hollywood, California, and I think we all know that there's an uneven political slant there that ends up making its way into the minds of our children. I largely agree with that point. Conservatives should have more of a presence in the creation of mass media and culture in America, because it is totally...
And humor.
I see a lot of kids. And I asked all of them if they've ever seen 1776, and over half have never even seen it themselves. So there's a great educational tool that's not being used by the history teachers in this country.
Yeah, I mean, ideally the standard should be the what, right? And the how to accompany the what should be totally autonomously decided by districts and states. But I agree with you, the how in most states needs to change rapidly, because we're telling students one thing in a certain style, whether it be lectures or PowerPoints, and it's just going right out the other ear. And by the time they're 25 years old, they don't have any idea about how their government works, which is a dangerous, dangerous thing, I believe.